Okay, so good evening, everybody.
Hi.
And what I wanted to look at tonight um, is the concept of Mahloket L'Shem Shamayim. Okay, and anybody who's studied Talmud or other halachic works is very familiar with that term. Mahloket L'Shem Shamayim literally means a disagreement or a dispute for the sake of heaven. Um, Now, in Hebrew, very often they'll say "L'shem Shemaim" for the sake of heaven rather than for the sake of God, but it really means for the sake of God. The idea is that um, and I think this really cannot be overstated, is that um, Judaism does not view disagreement as bad. Um, Quite the opposite. I mean, disagreement is seen as good because Judaism, or let's say rabbinic Judaism, is an intellectual tradition, right? I mean, again, for people who are trained in the tradition, if you were to say what is sort of the quintessential, what is the most Jewish activity, um, it's study. I mean, if you in a yeshiva, um, of course they daven 3 times a day, but the davening is very, I don't want to say perfunctory, but it's you would never find like Hazanistic flourishes or repetitions or anything like that because it takes away the time from studying. And what you're there to do is study. Um, and the idea is that by engaging in disagreement, um, we sharpen each other's minds, right? And it causes us, and um, you may have heard me say this, but in many ways, like the highest compliment that somebody can pay me as a rabbi is to tell me that they disagreed with my sermon. Um, and the reason that I say that is because, I mean, if somebody says to me, "Oh, great sermon, Rabbi," what does that mean, right? Why are they saying it's a great sermon? They could say it's a great sermon because they agreed with it. They could say it's a great sermon because it was funny. They could say it's a great sermon because it was short, right? They could say it's a great sermon because I wasn't loud enough to wake them up from their schluff during the sermon, right? But if you tell me that you disagreed with it, right, I know 2 things. You listened to what I had to say and you thought about it, right? Now this is all on the assumption that you're disagreeing with what I actually said rather than what you imagine I said. And it's not rare for people to disagree with things that I never actually said. Um, but which is right now we have tapes, right? But if you disagree with what I actually said, that to me is a compliment, right? And somebody who asks a lot of questions and then is like apologizing for asking questions, um, don't apologize for asking questions, right? It also forces me to sharpen my argument, and maybe I'll even change my mind based on the question that was asked, right? So what we are worried about is not disagreement. We're worried about disagreement that becomes destructive, right? And it becomes destructive because it's done in a disrespectful way. It's carried out to the extent that people on the losing side um, could walk away from the community, right? And I mean, that is a sin in Judaism. There's a statement in the Talmud, al tifrosh min hatzibur, right? Do not separate yourself from the community, right? So the tradition gives us certain wisdom about how disagreements should be conducted. All right. So a couple of years ago, really just about 2 years ago, right now, which was June and July of 2022, I participated in a fellowship called Mahloket Matters, which was under the auspices of Pardes. Pardes is a yeshiva in Jerusalem. It was, I think, maybe even the first egalitarian yeshiva. Interestingly, it's not religiously egalitarian. I mean, it operates by Orthodox rules, so women who are studying there don't lead services or count in the minyan, but men and women study Talmud together. Okay, now there are lots of places where that happens, but back in the 70s when Pardes started, it was the only place where men and women studied Talmud together. And like many I mean, as the borders are breaking down, and we're learning on Zoom and not just in person, Pardes is now operating in North America as well. So this was under the auspices of Pardes, and they run a lot of different cohorts. They run cohorts for teachers, for principals, for rabbis, et cetera, et cetera. So I was in the second cohort of conservative rabbis. So, full disclosure, the sources that I'm going to present tonight, I mean, you'll see, it's a source sheet. So this is one of the source sheets that we used in the class. So let me go ahead and share that. Okay. Everybody can see that? Yeah. All right. And by the way, and I mean, I say this every class, and I know it's hard to like overcome habit, but feel free to keep your microphone unmuted. We're a small group, you're all well behaved. You can just jump in if you have a comment or a question. So here is the first source, and it may at first seem a little bit puzzling, and I have to say, I mean, one of the fun things about teaching is that you learn, right? And I went back, I've been preparing this class for a while, and I finally understood at a deeper level, I think, the significance of this text. All right, so this is from the Midrash on Psalms. So it's a fairly late text. It's around 900 CE in Eretz Yisrael, which is very unusual because there weren't a lot of Jews in Eretz Yisrael in 900 CE, but this was produced by that community. Okay, Rabbi Yanai said the Torah was not given in a clear-cut manner. Rather, on every statement God said to Moses, he would say 49 reasons, word in Hebrew is panim, which literally means faces, right? So 49 reasons the matter could be pure, and 49 reasons why the matter could be impure, right? So, like every mitzvah that was given in the Torah is subject to interpretation, right? And there's a statement in the Talmud that nobody could be appointed as a member of the Sanhedrin unless they came up with 49 reasons. So 49 reasons like sort of like a round number, right? 7 times 7, 7 squared. 49 reasons to declare a sheretz, with sheretz like shrimp and lobsters and creepy crawly things. Those are all shiratzim. So you could not be allowed to be a member of the Sanhedrin unless you could come up with 49 different ways to declare a sheretz to be kosher. Okay, so this is not like unusual, right? So the Torah is not clear cut. So Moses said to God, Master of the universe, when will we know the truth of the matter? Right? And God said, go according to the majority. Okay? Acharei rabim lehatot. This is a quote from Exodus 23, chapter 2. Although, what's interesting about this quote is that it is totally ripped out of context. All right, the Torah does say follow the majority. Okay, there are those 3 words, follow the majority, but the whole verse says do not follow the majority to do evil, right? So it'd be like a a restaurant review where the restaurant just ran on this pay on its website, extraordinary, the Washington Post, right? Whereas the complete phrase from the reviewer was, this was the most extraordinary, abominable meal I have ever had, right? So it says, do not follow the majority to do evil, but the tradition understands that as saying follow the majority. If the majority rules, it is impure, it is impure. If the majority rules, it is pure, it is pure. Okay, so, well, I have some thoughts on this, but let me get your thoughts or reactions to this verse. Yeah, Dee.
I was immediately going to disagree until you put in the disclaimer, because I think that society gets into a lot of trouble following that that line of thinking, and yet most of our decision making, especially organizationally, comes with going exactly with that premise. And usually I can't condense what I'm thinking, so I'm going to skip around a little bit and not apologize for it. Sometimes, how do I say this? Sometimes in arguing something, and by that I mean the discourse of both sides of an issue, pro and con, you can learn something new that will change your mind, and that it might be morally based or ethically based, and it might be sound, very much going against the majority. And a lot of times when that happens, people don't have the courage to stand up and make that disclaimer for fear that the majority will ridicule them or dismiss them or whatever. So it's something that I struggle with a lot, and it's something very interestingly that happens in our events committee meetings. because we definitely, I think I'm looking at the screen and Sue's the only one here who could say that I'm not telling the truth or that I am. But we get into some pretty heavy disagreements and discussions. And it's amazing because as hot as they get, somebody provokes, even accidentally, a different way of thinking of something. And it actually saves a proposed event or keeps an event from happening at that time because it wasn't well thought out.
Mhm.
I know that's a long-winded way of making a point, but I think that without your caveat, that gets a lot of us in a lot of hot water.
My caveat meaning what?
Unless it's, well, I'm using the term that you put in, unless it's impure, I'm using it in a different manner
Right.
than kashrut.
No, I agree with you. Look, I mean, there can definitely be a problem with simply, always follow the majority, right? I mean, when I was in high school, right, if you had asked me when I was in high school who was your greatest hero, at that time I probably would have said Henry David Thoreau, right?
Really?
And Thoreau went to jail because he wouldn't pay his taxes, right? Because he didn't want to support the Mexican War. Right now, I don't know, but I'm assuming that the majority of people in the United States at that time supported the Mexican War, right? And certainly, the United States has done questionable and dumb and immoral things that were supported by the majority, right? So this principle can be troubling, right? I mean, because it's also telling us essentially that there's no objective truth, right? There's no objective truth, right? And that's what, when I say I understood it like more deeply now than I did 2 years ago, because God isn't saying if the majority rules it is impure, we treat it as impure, right? And if the majority rules it's pure, we treat it as pure. It's saying if the majority rules it is impure, it is impure, right? And therefore, I mean, I don't want to get too bogged down in this text because this is kind of preparatory to everything else. But there is a halachic principle, and it's the same majority idea. Okay, kol man de paresh miruba paresh. Okay, everything is assumed to be part of the majority. Okay. I mean, I'll give you an example. Okay. If you go to France, right, it is a well established halachic rule in even the most orthodox of communities that you can go to France and go into any bakery and buy a baguette, right? Because French bakeries never, ever, ever use lard for their baguettes. Okay. And you don't have to say, well, maybe there's this one bakery and so. No, the absolute right. It's just the majority, it's sort of a known thing. Okay. So that, if a person walks into the shul and we don't know them, I don't have to investigate whether they're Jewish before I count them in a million or offer them an aliyah, right? Because people, right, the majority of strangers who walk into our shul are Jewish, right? Now, if they give me some kind of reason to believe that they're actually not Jewish, then I have to investigate, right? But you know, under normal circumstances, we don't have to investigate, right? So everything is assumed to be along with the majority. Okay, so now here's the deal, right? And I've discussed this before, right? You are walking down the street and you find on the sidewalk, right? I mean, it's not realistic today, but not so long ago, right? You would go into a butcher, right? And you would buy a piece of meat, and the butcher would wrap it in a piece of butcher paper, right? Which is why it's called butcher paper, right? And tie it with a string and give it to you, right? So, I mean, I even remember that, at least in Brooklyn, right? So you are walking down the street, you see a piece of meat on the sidewalk tied in butcher paper with a string. There's nothing on it that tells you what butcher shop it came from or what it is. It's just a piece of meat on the sidewalk, right? Okay, now here's the shocking thing, right? If there are 10 butcher shops on that street and 6 of them are kosher, halachically, that piece of meat is kosher, right? Because kol man de paresh meruba paresh, right? It's so everything, right? If the majority of butcher shops on that street are kosher, that piece of meat is kosher. You don't have to go to a lab and give them a little piece of the meat to run a DNA in, right? It it is kosher. If the majority of butcher shops on that street are treif, it is treif. Okay, and note, not treated as kosher, treated as treif, is kosher, is treif, right? So that theoretically, you now have brought into your house kosher pork chops, right? Because, right, it actually, right? So there's no objective truth, okay, which is somewhat disturbing, right? I have to say it's somewhat disturbing, and I am not of the opinion that I would actually eat such a piece of meat, but it's not like not realistic in this day and age, right? When you know we don't have butcher shops and we don't walk anywhere, right? So, but in theory, this is the case, right? Now, as a pragmatic matter, it works wonderfully, right? You just follow the majority, right? But this is going deeper. It is actually, to me at least, saying there is no such thing as objective truth, which is somewhat disturbing. Okay. Um, any other comments or questions on this text? All right, then we'll go on to the next one.
Rabbi,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious. Like, I don't know if this applies, but what happens if, like, I'm thinking in Nazi Germany, and you had the majority who supported Hitler, and you know, you could have the majority that supports something that's not right or not moral or not correct. Right. Would it still apply?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, first of all, as a historical matter, I don't believe that a majority ever supported Hitler. You know, he was elected coalition stuff and whatever. I mean, but look, this doesn't allow you to commit acts that are contrary to halacha, right? I mean, for example, you know, if the majority of Israelis said we have to kill everybody in Gaza, right? Now they don't, right? But if they did, that would not make killing everybody in Gaza okay, right? And it would not mean that soldiers in the IDF could morally and legitimately just participate in that killing, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that, right? So but the application of this, look, is problematic at times, right? Because our sense of, right, our understanding, our frankly Western understanding of what democracy means is not simply majority rule, right? It is also, minority rights, right? That you can't, it's why we have a constitution, right? And why the constitution, although amendable, it's so complicated to amend it, right? So that you can't simply have, all right, now we are the majority, so we're gonna jail everybody who disagrees with us, right? We are the majority, so we're gonna make all non-Christian religions illegal, right? We are the majority, so we're gonna put all people whose native language is Spanish in jail, right? We're the majority, so we're gonna put everybody of Japanese ancestry into camps, right? Which we did, right? And it was only much later that, we came to understand that that was wrong, even though it was supported by the majority, right? So when you're dealing with kind of like basic moral decisions, it's more complicated, right?
Yeah.
It is more complicated. So I'm not sure I have a better answer than that. Okay. Yeah, D.
Rabbi, if I'm going to jump into where you're going, I apologize and just tell me, as I know you will, not to. But it seems to me, we had a little bit of a talk a couple of days ago. One of the things that you were talking about Saturday and also Friday night last week was to learn how to disagree respectfully. And it seems to me that if you're dealing with, whether it's an organizational meeting or whatever, if you're dealing with people that you respect and you trust, you're much more amenable to listen to the other person or the other group or what appears to be the majority's position than if you have ill will, distrust, disrespect, or are afraid of losing control or power. I don't know if this is where you're going, but that was the back door, was what I was talking about before, in terms of not necessarily thinking it's so good to always go with the decision of the majority. And one of the things that made me change my mind on that, though of course it goes against Robert's rules, is one of the things that I learned, besides listening, is that most often we will forget to ask for abstentions or ignore abstentions. There is often pieces or kernels of wisdom or rationales for giving you a different way of looking at something by asking why people are abstaining.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's because they're afraid to express their opinion that's going against the majority.
Right. Look, there can definitely be that sort of peer pressure, right? Let's hold that, okay? Because I think I will answer your questions as we go on.
Okay.
All right, at least in a roundabout way. Okay, so this is the second disagreement for the sake of heaven. Okay, so this is from the Mishnah, right? Pirkei Avot, right? ethics of the fathers. All right, any disagreement, mahloket, that is for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim, is destined to endure, and one that is not for the sake of heaven will not continue to exist. Okay, now this is not my translation, and I'm not sure why they translate the hit kayem as endure in the first place and continue to exist in the second place. And the Hebrew is sofa lehit kayem, which literally means, it's hard to translate that exactly, okay? But what it's not saying is that if it's a mahloket l'shem shamayim, you're going to argue it forever, right? What it's saying is that something that is a mahloket l'shem shamayim, well, it may continue, right? But also, I'm not sure how to translate this exactly. I'm really not sure how to translate this. But what it is saying is that a mahloket l'shem shamayim is a good thing. Okay, it's a good thing. And what makes something a mahloket l'shem shamayim is both, I would say, two things. It is the way the mahloket is conducted, and also the motivation for the mahloket. Okay, so what is a disagreement that is for the sake of heaven? The disagreement between Hillel and Shammai, right? And one that is not for the sake of heaven, Korach and his group. Okay, so, right, Hillel, I mean, I mentioned Hillel and Shammai in my email, well, yesterday and today, right? That, I mean, nobody doubts that Hillel and Shammai both acted in good faith, right? They both acted in good faith. The reason that the tradition generally prefers Hillel over Shammai is not because Shammai wasn't acting in good faith or arguing in good faith, right? And it wasn't that Hillel was objectively right, because we go back to the first verse, right? The reason that the tradition prefers Hillel is because Hillel respected Shammai more than Shammai respected Hillel. Okay, and that is a reason for the tradition to prefer. But I'll give you like an example of what the tradition means by this good faith, okay? And this is from the Talmud, right? So Hillel and Shammai would disagree about certain marriage laws, right? Now, if you have disagreement over marriage laws, right, that's a big problem, right? Because somebody could, be the offspring of a marriage that one side permits, but the other side prohibits, right? And therefore, in the eyes of the other side, they're a mamzer, or it's adultery, or they're not Jewish or whatever, right? But they would still intermarry with each other, okay? Which I take it to mean like, right, that if an Orthodox rabbi calls me and says, such and such person grew up in your congregation and now they've come to me for marriage, are they okay? Right? That I would say to that rabbi, they're okay, and they would believe me, because if they weren't okay, I would also tell that rabbi, right? In other words, I would say to that rabbi, well, you should know that this person's mother converted under my supervision, right? Which makes them not Jewish in the eyes of most Orthodox rabbis, right? So that's where like the good faith is involved. In other words, right, it doesn't bother me that an Orthodox rabbi says somebody that I converted isn't actually Jewish. Doesn't bother me in the least. Okay, it bothers me if an Orthodox rabbi says, you know, conservative rabbis only do it for the money, or conservative rabbis do it because they want to destroy Judaism or something like that, right? That bothers me because that is not crediting my good faith, right? But as long as they're crediting my good faith and it's based on sort of objective disagreements, then that's fine, right? And that would be l'shem shamayim. That would be a disagreement that we would have. That would be l'shem shamayim, and I have no problem with that, right? That, in fact, quite the opposite. I think that should be a basic rule that, you know, between the different denominations, we should be honest about, you know, where we disagree and not make it personal and not, you know, say, oh, it's only because they do it for the money or whatever. Okay. So now we have the Meiri coming to explain, you know, what this Mishnah from a vote means, right? The Mahloket l'shem Shamayim, Hillel and Shammai, for one would rule on a matter and the other would disagree with him, in order to understand the truth and not just for the sake of provocation or a desire to win, right? And that's why the disagreements of Hillel and Shammai is a machloket l'shem shamayim, right? And a machloket that is not l'shem shamayim, Korach, right? I mean, I assume you're all familiar with the story of Korach. If not, it's coming up in a few weeks, right? They came to complain about our teacher Moses, may he rest in peace, about his leadership out of jealousy and provocation and a desire to win, right? It was not, right? They just wanted to win, okay? So now, whether this is true or not, if you look at the biblical story, it's not actually that clear cut in my estimation, right? But the way the rabbinic tradition certainly makes Korach into this power mad demagogue. Okay. So if there's, you know, questions or comments on actually either the Mishnah or the Meiri, please, you know, go ahead. And if not, we'll go on to what I consider to be like an important distillation of what a machloket l'shem shamayim really is. Okay. 4 pillars. 1, listen to the other side and be open to admitting that you might be wrong. Okay. 2, check your motivation. Are you trying to win or to understand? 2b, are you trying to win or to solve problems, right? 3, debate the issues without attacking people and harming relationships. And 4, consider that you might both be right despite holding opposite positions, right? Now, let's go back to point 1, right? Listen to the other side and be open to admitting that you might be wrong. Okay, now, I mean, here's the thing. This was a few years ago, but I was preparing a sermon dealing precisely with, you know, these kinds of issues. And I was reading an article, and the author of the article said that in almost every instance, when we are involved in an a disagreement with somebody, no, or not even just a discussion with somebody, we are listening to formulate our response. We are already formulating our response in our head as the other person is speaking, right? And, it hit me like a ton of bricks because I realized at the time that is absolutely what I did, right? I did that all the time. And if you are formulating your response as the other person is speaking, you're not really listening to them, right? You're certainly not seeking to understand them. You're seeking to respond, meaning to refute, right? And this is, and this is to some extent like a male female thing, right? Like, you know, Kelly will say to me, "You're not listening to what I said." And I'll say, "Of course I am." And I will repeat back to her word for word what she just said. But you know what? She's actually right because I could spout back the words, but I wasn't really listening, right? In the sense of seeking to understand, right? And I think that this is a huge problem, right? We are not seeking to understand if we're formulating our response while the other person is talking, right? So listen to the other side and like be open to admitting that you might be wrong, right? And I mean, that sort of ton of bricks moment, I believe, hopefully, actually changed like my whole perspective because yeah, I could really be wrong, right? And then what is your motivation, right? Are you trying to win or to understand, right? Are you trying to win or to solve, right? In other words, sometimes we get so entrenched in our own position, right, that we just want to win the argument. We're not interested in anything else, right? And debate without attacking people and harming relationships, right? And the fourth one, consider that you might both be right despite holding opposite positions, right? And that is, I think, the hardest one in some ways, but it gets us back, to the first source, right? That there is maybe no objective reality, right? Any thoughts or comments on this? Because this to me, yeah, D.
Um, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a light bulb for me. If one, I don't want to say you, because I don't mean you, I mean generically.
If right,
We,
one. Yeah.
if you get to the point where you can being passionate about your position, but even and I'm using the word argue, it could be either just differences of opinion or it could be a heated whatever. But if you get to the point where you get even an aha moment where there's the possibility that, which is not really logical, that you both can be right, I can't think of a better kernel of wisdom than that line, because that opens up a much more fertile ground for compromise, for a win-win, not loss of face, not loss of power, not loss of an event. So for me, that's a very profound item.
Right. I mean, frankly, I mean, this whole paragraph should be tattooed on the forehead of almost every person in this country, right? Now, obviously, like we don't allow tattooing, but I mean, I think really, and I'm almost thinking that like nobody should be allowed to be on a board or a committee without making a written commitment to abide by these 4 rules. Right? I mean, I really think so. And you know, I'm really worried about, you know, what's going to happen once we start deciding, right? Are we going to sell the building? Or are we not going to sell the building? Right?
Unfortunately,
And look, here is a situation where both sides could indeed be right. Anyway, Joe, yeah.
In the corporate world in which I dwell, this has become the mantra, these 4 points. You know, but there we're all working toward a common objective of producing a good product and making a profit. But as you say, I think in our politics and culture, these 4 pillars don't often stand up very well.
Right. Yeah. No, I think you know, I think you're right. I mean, it's interesting to know that this has become so sort of widespread in the corporate world, right? And I think, you know, by analogy, right? I mean, everybody who is a member of our shul, right, wants a thriving, flourishing shul that can pay its bills, right? We all want that, right? And you know, what we disagree on is how to get that, right? And that is a Mahloket L'Shem Shamayim, right? But it becomes not a Mahloket L'Shem Shamayim when people say, oh, you're trying to destroy the shul, right? Or you have a hidden agenda or whatever, right? I mean, and that's where disagreements become really destructive, right? Because there is no objective truth. I mean, the objective truth, I mean, you know, the problem is that in American society, like even things that are objectively true are not accepted as objectively true, right? That, you know, vote tallies or, you know, the fact that COVID is caused by a virus, right? And the fact that, you know, vaccines, right? I mean, so that, you know, right? So that becomes a problem, right? But you know, I start from the assumption that there's nobody in the shul and there's nobody on the board who has a secret agenda to destroy the shul, right? And the question is, you know, what's best for the shul? I mean, even like, look, even people who, whatever, I don't even want to go there, okay? But I really do believe that nobody should be permitted to participate in discussion or decision making without, you know, obligating themselves to these 4 pillars of a Mahloket L'Shem Shamayim. Okay, now let's go on. I don't know if, and I don't know, Baby Joe, whether this is something that people discuss in the corporate world too, the elephant and rider analogy. This is from Jonathan Haidt, who is a social psychologist. He teaches in the NYU Business School. You see him as a talking head a lot on, you know, various programs. But he talks about the elephant and the rider. Okay, the rider is the conscious verbal thinking part of your brain The elephant is the automatic, the emotional, visceral part of your brain, right? And there's actually a fairly short video about this on YouTube. I want to see if I can. I'm not sure if you all will be able to hear it, so I'll put the captions on as well. Oh, I don't want French. I mean, I have nothing against French, but I for one don't understand it. So hold on a second. I don't want French. I want English auto-generated. Okay, great. Now let's move you all over. And now, all right. If you're not able to hear this, say we can't hear it, and we won't look at the video. But
Can't hear it.
all right, but can you see the subtitles?
Yes.
All right, so that'll be good enough. But it says rider, it's rider.
I can't keep up with it. Hmm.
All right, so so that the elephant and the rider, and this is really, really true in terms of, I mean, it's true almost universally, right? I mean, if you ask people why they support something or oppose, it's often just sort of visceral, right? I mean, it's like, from the first time I saw that guy and heard him open his mouth, I hated him, right? Or from the first time I saw that guy and heard him open his mouth, I loved him, right? And like, as a rabbi, I mean, I assume, right, that and this is one of the benefits of longevity, right? But that, in any, right, when you get hired and you have, you're the new rabbi in a congregation, 10% of the people are going to hate you immediately. And it doesn't matter, like, it's just a visceral thing, right? And the benefit is longevity is that the vast majority of those people are no longer members of the shul, right? I mean, there are maybe a couple still who have stuck it out, right? But to a certain extent, it's not rational, right? And people's responses to ritual changes, people's responses to, you know, the smallest thing, like changing the time of the services, right? Or whatever it may be, right? That's usually the elephant. It's not the rider. And the, you know, so I mean, to continue this metaphor, what Haidt says, right? If you see the two of them, right, it may seem to you that the rider is in control, right? Because he is holding the reins and he's directing where the elephant should go and so on and so forth. But the rider is in control
because he's letting,
because the elephant lets him be in control,
right?
right? And the minute the elephant decides, no, nah, I'm in charge, the elephant is in charge,
Right.
right? And so what Haidt says, and I think he's right, is that if you are a leader who wants to motivate change, you have to figure out a way to speak not only to the rider, but also to the elephant, right? And if you can't speak to the elephant, you're not going to win, right? And let me stop the share. We'll continue this next week. I mean, I think that there's enough, but you know, I've learned that you know, in terms of like dealing with stuff in the shul, is that you can't simply say that that's just an emotional reaction. All right, I'll give you an example, right, of something that really happened, right? When we first started renting to churches, right? And by the way, you know, we have lost members, right? People, because of that, right? Because people say, you know, I know we need the money, but it just rubs me the wrong way. Okay, and fine. I mean, you know, there's not like anything that I can argue about that, right? But you know, the largest church said, you know, we always have food after services. Can we have that in the social hall? Right. And when I was asked that question, I said, yes. Okay. Because I am looking at it from the perspective of halacha, right? And from the perspective of halacha, right, there is no such thing as kosher space or kosher air or kosher trash cans, right? There's kosher food, right, which can be kosher but becomes treif by virtue of contact with non-kosher utensils or whatever, right? So halachically, there is absolutely no reason why non-Jews who don't have to keep kosher, right, can't eat non-kosher food inside our building. I said the absolutely, you know, bottom line inviolable condition is the kitchen has to be locked, right? Because if the kitchen is locked, there is no risk that somebody's going to bring some treif into the kitchen or go into the kitchen and say, oh, we need a couple more serving forks, right? And that's a real problem, right? But Gentiles eating treif food in our social hall is not a problem, right? But when this came up to the ritual committee, right, it was just like sort of visceral, right, for a couple of people, right? And it was the elephant, it was not the rider, right? And there is no doubt that halachically I was right, right? But ultimately, it wasn't a question of halacha, it was a question of feelings and emotions, right? And since that day, when other rabbis ask me, I say, look, you know, it's if it's a matter of feelings and emotion, you have to take that into consideration too, right? That you could be halachically correct, but emotionally completely wrong, right? And I do understand, right? Because, there are certain smells that linger, right? And nobody wants to walk into the shul and it smells like Hazer. I absolutely get that, right? But um, and this is the other point, all right? Is that the United Synagogue said a few years ago, right, that shuls are autonomous in deciding who can be a member, right? Which means, basically, right, can a non-Jew married to a Jew be a member of the shul, right? And the United Synagogue said that's up to you. That's up to you, right? And then in like rabbinic discussions, it'll be, well, like, but what happens if, the decision is made, by a vote of 10-9, and one of the 10 is a non-Jew or whatever. And my response to that is, look, if you are making like mission critical decisions by a vote of 10-9, you've lost anyway, right? Like if we, take a vote, right? Like the merger, right, 12 years ago or whatever it was, right? If that, and it actually didn't even get a majority, right? But if that had won by a narrow majority, it would have been lost, right? And if we vote ultimately to sell our building, right, by 51-49, we've lost, right? It doesn't matter whether it's 51-49 to sell or 51-49 to not sell, right? Or uh, a search committee decides to offer you a job, right? And the vote in the search committee was 5-4 to offer you that job. Don't take that job, right? Don't take that job. It has to be, I'm not saying 100%, but it has to be a broad consensus, right? And if it's not a broad consensus, you've lost, right? It reminds, the favorite joke among rabbis, right, is that the rabbi is in the hospital, right? And the president of the shul comes to visit him or her and says, I bring you wishes for a full recovery from the board by a vote of 12-8, right?
Oh God.
Right.
That
I don't want the board to wish me a full recovery by a vote of 12-8, right? If that ever happens,
you can say
right?
that.
And what about the congregation?
You can say
well, but you understand the point, right?
yes, but you can say that as a joke, but I hate to tell you that's partially the mentality that KS has.
No, it's a problem.
That's not a joke.
It is a problem.
I don't mind having a disagreement with somebody, even a passionate one. And one of the beauties of the last job that I had after I retired the first time and went to work the second time, I went to work at Johns Hopkins University, and it was for 11 years. And the magnificence of that job was that we could sit and sometimes it was policy, sometimes it was curriculum, sometimes it was personnel. A lot of times it was who was going to be admitted to the program. And we had professional disagreements, we had personal disagreements, but no matter how passionate it was, when that discussion was over, that discussion was over, and there was no exception. There was never any ill will. And sometimes the most passionate of disagreements later on became some of the funniest jokes about how could we ever have gotten, to that level. And never in my entire professional career did I ever have so much richness and ability to learn from. It was not only a matter of peer colleagues, but also of hierarchy, administration versus not. And it's a magnificent thing when you can see it work. It's just absolutely magnificent. And we would never be where we are if that's the way that we had conducted ourselves all these years.
Right. I don't disagree with, and I'll give you like two like real life examples of what you're talking about. Okay, the first, which is a little bit more sort of arcane, but two faculty members at JTS, Neil Gilman and Joel Roth. Okay, those names may mean absolutely nothing to you, although I've spoken about one of Gilman's books not infrequently, Sacred Fragments. But when and Neil Gilman was as far left on theological and halachic issues as you could get and still be like within the spectrum of the conservative movement. And Joel Roth was as far right as you could get within the spectrum of the conservative movement. Right? They disagreed on everything, right? But they were best friends, right? And similarly, right, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia disagreed on everything, but they were best friends, right? And I mean, maybe we should have another rule, right? Everybody is required to have a best friend with whom they disagree about everything.
I do.
Right. I mean, so that's the sign. That's the sign of a Mahloket L'Shem Shamayim, right? It really is. All right. We're running a bit late, so I'm gonna thank everybody for participating. I know Joe, like if it goes too long, he gets off. I don't take it personally. He probably has to get up very early for work. So Shabbat Shalom.
I'm just sorry. I'm deeply
Shabbat
sorry
Shalom.
that you did not have not only a larger audience, but some people who really would benefit greatly from this. And I wonder what would be the appropriate way. I know that it's taped, but